Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite the stack of executive orders here, all signed in the first month of this new presidency. It's really a fascinating peek into what a leader's priorities are, almost like a political to-do list. And what we're doing today is kind of taking apart these executive orders to see what they tell us about this administration's worldview and how that might impact you.
Yeah, it's not every day you see so many executive orders issued in such rapid fire. This isn't exactly business as usual. It suggests a very, very deliberate and maybe even radical shift in U.S. policy.
Yeah, and one of the big things that jumps out is how many of them are all about America first. But what does that even mean in practice?
Right. That's the million-dollar question. We got to go beyond the slogans and look at the actual policy changes. Like, look at Executive Order 14150. It makes America First the official guiding principle for all foreign policy decisions.
Yeah, that feels like a pretty big step away from how we've been doing things.
Well, historically, America First has meant different things at different points in time. But here, in this context, it seems to be about prioritizing U.S. interests above everything else, even if it means stepping back from, traditional alliances or global commitments.
And we see that play out in some pretty major moves, like
Yeah.
the withdrawal from the World Health Organization, the WHO, which is outlined in Executive Order 44155. And then there's the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, the exit from that, in Executive Order 441162. And then we see Executive Order 44199, cutting funding to a couple of UN initiatives, UNRWA, which helps Palestinian refugees, and the UN Human Rights Council.
Yeah, I mean, these aren't small symbolic moves. We're talking a significant break
Okay.
from decades of U.S. foreign policy.
So if America First is all about putting U.S. interests first, is withdrawing from these organizations, is that actually good for us?
That's the big question, right? Take the WHO withdrawal. This administration, they're arguing that the WHO is too influenced by China and that it didn't do a good job with the COVID-19 pandemic. They think that going it alone lets the U.S. pursue its own health strategies without being tied to what they see as a flawed global organization.
But wouldn't leaving the WHO make it harder for the U.S. to work with others on global health issues? I mean, wouldn't that leave us less prepared if another pandemic hits?
Yeah, and that's the other side of the argument. Critics are saying global health threats need international cooperation. They're worried this move could actually hurt efforts to track and control diseases and ultimately make Americans less safe.
So it's like a trade-off then, asserting independence versus the advantages of working together.
Exactly. And that tension, you see it popping up in other areas too. Take the Paris Agreement. Pulling out of that shows a skepticism about global efforts to fight climate change. This administration says the agreement unfairly burdens American businesses, and they believe the U.S. can deal with climate change through its own policies.
But this is a global issue. Can the U.S. really make a difference on its own? And what about our relationships with our allies, the ones who are sticking with the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, those are definitely valid points. Critics are saying the U.S. withdrawal weakens the global push to lower emissions, and that it could hurt America's image on the world stage.
So even in just these first few executive orders, we're already seeing a pattern. This administration is putting a huge emphasis on sovereignty, and they seem to be questioning the value of global commitments.
You see that most clearly in Executive Order 42155. It justifies leaving the WHO by saying the U.S. shouldn't be subject to what they call inappropriate political influence from other countries.
Mhm.
And then there's Executive Order 14162. It claims past international agreements don't reflect our country's values. That suggests they want to renegotiate or ditch those agreements.
It almost sounds like they're saying we're doing things our way, whether international organizations or other countries like it or not.
Yeah, it's a rejection of multilateralism, that idea that nations should work together to solve world problems. They're moving toward a more unilateral approach, where the U.S. acts in what it sees as its best interest, even if that means going against the flow.
And this brings up a question for you, listener. What do you think the upsides and downsides are of a less globally involved U.S.? Could this lead to a more fragmented world order? Or is it a needed rebalancing to protect what's best for America? Something to think about as we keep looking into these executive orders.
Keep in mind, these are just the first steps of a brand new administration. It's still up in the air how these policies will actually be put into practice and what the long-term effects will be.
And there are definitely more controversial moves to unpack, like this connection between economic policy and national security in Executive Order 12209, which deals with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or the FCPA.
Oh yeah, that one definitely turned some heads.
Hmm.
The FDPA basically says U.S. companies can't bribe foreign officials to get business advantages.
But Executive Order 12209 says, hold on, it wants to pause enforcement of the FCPA because they say it puts American companies at a disadvantage in the global market.
The administration is thinking that if we loosen these regulations, it'll boost American business, and that'll make our national security stronger. It's all part of this America First idea, using our economic muscle to flex our global influence.
But wouldn't some people see this as putting profits ahead of ethical behavior? Wouldn't easing up on anti-corruption rules make it easier for companies to do shady things?
That's the big debate. Critics are saying this move weakens our fight against corruption, and it could lead to a race to the bottom, where companies feel like they have to bribe people to compete. They think it could hurt America's moral standing and tarnish our reputation abroad.
So it's a tough call, right? How do you weigh the potential economic benefits against the ethical costs? What message does this send to the world about what America stands for?
It's a really tough question, and it gets even trickier when we look at some of the more assertive actions taken by this administration, like the sanctions on the International Criminal Court, which we'll dig into right after this.
So we were just talking about how the administration might loosen up anti-corruption rules, and it seems like that's just the beginning. When it comes to controversial foreign policy moves,
Yeah, for sure. There are a handful of other executive orders that take a much stronger stance, even directly targeting certain countries or institutions.
like Executive Order 1200203, this one puts sanctions on the International Criminal Court, the ICC.
Yeah, that was a big one. The ICC is an international court that investigates war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, really serious stuff. It was created to hold people accountable for these terrible crimes, no matter what country they're from or their position.
But this administration, they're saying that the ICC is overstepping its boundaries, that it's infringing on U.S. sovereignty.
Right. They're really worried about the ICC investigating actions by U.S. military personnel or government officials. These sanctions are basically saying, nope, the U.S. won't cooperate with the ICC and will actively fight against their investigations.
That's a pretty bold move, isn't it? Challenging a core part of international justice.
It definitely raises some questions about how committed America is to international rules, and if we're willing to hold ourselves accountable for potential human rights violations.
Then there's Executive Order 11204. This one zeroes in on South Africa. It's interesting because it mixes economic measures with a more humanitarian approach.
Yeah. This executive order stirred up a lot of controversy. It basically says the U.S. is stopping aid to South Africa and that we should prioritize resettling Afrikaner refugees here in the U.S.
And the reason they're doing this is because of South Africa's land expropriation policy, which allows the government to take land without paying for it.
The administration is saying this policy is wrong. It violates property rights, and it's discrimination against white farmers specifically. They see it as a threat to South Africa's stability and their economy.
So by cutting off aid, they're putting economic pressure on South Africa, trying to get them to change their policy. And by offering to take in Afrikaner refugees, they're making a humanitarian gesture that also fits with their position on the land issue.
It's a complicated strategy, mixing hard power with soft power. It's also kind of risky. It could alienate a key African nation and get the U.S. more tangled up in a sensitive domestic issue.
So it's a very targeted approach, using different tools to achieve specific foreign policy objectives.
And that leads us to Executive Order 12211. This one's about the U.S. State Department. It's all about internal control, making sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to foreign policy.
It basically demands that the State Department strictly follows a president's foreign policy agenda.
It even goes as far as suggesting disciplinary action. For employees who don't toe the administration's line, it's about centralizing power, making sure the president's vision is carried out without any dissent or pushback.
That's a little concerning, don't you think? Doesn't diplomacy need some flexibility, some nuance? And shouldn't diplomats be able to share their professional opinions, even if they disagree with the administration?
You're absolutely right. Different viewpoints are often really important for effective diplomacy. This order seems to put loyalty and ideological agreement above open discussion and critical thinking.
If everyone at the State Department is just repeating the president's views, it could make for a very narrow and potentially flawed approach to foreign policy. It would be like an echo chamber, where any different opinions are silenced.
Right, and it could make it harder for the U.S. to adapt to changing situations or to build relationships with countries that have different perspectives.
Looking at all these executive orders, it seems like this administration is not afraid to shake things up on the world stage.
They're definitely willing to challenge long-standing norms and institutions. They seem to be taking a more confrontational approach to diplomacy and putting what they see as American interests above everything else.
But how will this all play out in the long run?
That's the big unknown. These are really bold moves with potentially huge consequences. We'll have to see how other countries react and what the ultimate impact will be on America's position and influence in the world.
So it's clear that this administration is charting a whole new course for U.S. foreign policy, and these executive orders give us a roadmap to understand their vision and their priorities. But there's one more thing that connects many of these executive orders that I wanted to discuss before we wrap up.
What's that?
Well, it looks like there's this interesting link between economic interests and what some might call a more moral approach to foreign policy.
Yeah, you're right. There's this subtle thread running through several of these executive orders.
Like Executive Order 14169, it puts a temporary hold on foreign aid. It says that the U.S. foreign aid industry often works against American values and interests.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement. It shows a very particular worldview. It suggests that U.S. aid, the way it's been given out in the past, may have actually helped ideas or things happening that this administration sees as bad or against American values.
So it's like they're saying, we're not just going to throw money at problems. We're going to be smarter about it, make sure our aid supports what we believe in.
Right. It's a values-driven approach to foreign aid. It's something that might appeal to some Americans, but it also makes you wonder how those values are decided and who gets to choose which countries or projects deserve help.
And that brings us back to Executive Order 12204, the one about South Africa, cutting off aid and helping Afrikaner refugees. It seems to be driven by both economic and moral concerns.
Yeah, you got it. The order specifically points to the South African government's land policy. They're calling it an attack on property rights and a form of racial discrimination. It fits with this administration's focus on protecting American interests and values around the world, even if it means getting involved in another country's business.
And by saying they'll take in Afrikaner refugees, they're taking a moral stand against what the South African government is doing, right?
Absolutely. It's a mix of hard power, by stopping aid, and soft power, by offering refuge. The message is pretty clear. The U.S. is ready to use whatever tools it takes to promote its vision of a fair and just world, at least how they define it.
So if we zoom out and look at everything, what story is this administration trying to tell with all these executive orders?
Well, they're definitely projecting an image of strength, being decisive, having a clear goal in mind. They're saying, America's back and we're going to look out for ourselves first. It's all about taking back control, both at home and on the world stage.
It's not just about stepping back from the world, though. It's about actively trying to change the world to match their values and interests.
Exactly. They're not afraid of a little conflict, whether it's with global organizations, other countries, or even people within their own government who disagree with them.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Well, you've just gotten a sneak peek at a potential turning point in U.S. foreign policy. This administration is making some big moves, and the impact will be felt globally.
These executive orders, they're basically a roadmap for a whole new era of how America interacts with the world. It's an era where national interests come first, where we rethink our global promises, and where we're willing to challenge the way things have always been done.
We can't predict what's going to happen, but we can definitely say that things are about to get interesting.
And as all this unfolds, you'll be in a great position to understand what's happening in this new global landscape. The decisions made in Washington have consequences everywhere. So it's up to each of us to stay informed, think critically, and hold our leaders responsible.
That's a really important point to remember, and a great way to wrap things up. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of executive orders. We'll see you next time as this story continues to develop.